Hey guys, tonight we're going to talk about something a little different. Something that's probably not going to keep you awake at night, which is exactly the point. So go ahead and dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe adjust that pillow one more time. We're diving into the surprisingly mundane world of medieval executioners. And not the dramatic stuff you're picturing. No, we're talking about what these guys did during the 99% of the time when they weren't actually executing anyone. Because here's the thing. Medieval executioners weren't exactly busy every single day. It's not like there was a line out the door every morning. Most towns might have a handful of proceedings per year, maybe a dozen if it was a particularly unruly year. So what did these men do with all that downtime? Well, buckle up, because the answer is somehow both boring and deeply weird at the same time. Let's start with the basics. Being an executioner in medieval Europe was not, shall we say, a prestigious gig. In fact, it was pretty much the opposite. These guys existed in this strange social limbo where they were absolutely necessary but also completely despised. They were what society called dishonorable people. And that wasn't just a mean nickname, it was an actual legal and social category. Dishonorable, unehrlich, if you were in the German-speaking parts of Europe. It meant you were tainted, unclean, the kind of person that regular folks didn't want to sit next to at church. Actually, scratch that, you probably weren't allowed in the regular part of the church at all. You'd be stuck in the back, or outside, or in some specially designated spot where your presence wouldn't contaminate the good Christian folk. And it wasn't just executioners. This whole category of dishonorable people included a bunch of jobs that someone had to do, but nobody wanted to be associated with. Knackers, who dealt with dead animals, tanners, who worked with hides and blood, gravediggers, latrine cleaners, bailiffs sometimes. Anyone whose work involved death, blood, filth, or the enforcement of unpleasant laws. Basically, if your job made polite society slightly queasy, you were probably dishonorable. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Because executioners were stuck in this social category, they couldn't just go get a normal job on their days off. It's not like they could moonlight as a baker or a cobbler. The guilds wouldn't allow it. Regular tradesmen wouldn't work alongside them. Their very presence was considered polluting. So, executioners had to find other ways to make ends meet, and those ways were usually jobs that were just as stigmatized as the whole execution thing. Let's talk about the medical work first, because that's probably the most surprising one. Medieval executioners were often the go-to guys for certain types of medical treatment. And I know what you're thinking. Why would anyone want medical care from the person who literally chops heads off for a living? Well, it actually makes a weird kind of sense. Executioners knew anatomy. They had hands-on experience with the human body in a way that most people, including a lot of physicians, didn't. They knew where the bones were, how joints worked, what happened when you applied force in certain ways. This made them surprisingly good at things like setting broken bones, treating dislocations, and dealing with other physical injuries. In fact, in some parts of Europe, executioners were basically the town's unofficial orthopedic surgeons. Got a broken arm? Go see the executioner. Dislocated shoulder? Executioner. Weird lump that needs cutting out? You guessed it. The guy who separates heads from bodies could probably separate you from that unsightly growth. They also dealt with skin conditions, sold ointments and salves, and sometimes even pulled teeth, because, of course, they did. The executioner's medical kit was apparently pretty extensive. They'd have all sorts of concoctions, usually made from things that, well, let's just say the ingredients were creative. Animal fat, herbs, sometimes bits of executed criminals. Yeah, that was a thing. There was this whole belief in medieval Europe that the bodies of executed criminals had healing properties. The executioner had access to those bodies, so naturally he became the guy selling corpse-based medicine. A finger from a hung thief might cure warts. Blood from a beheading criminal could treat epilepsy, or so people believed.
and the executioner was right there, ready to make a little extra money off these superstitions. It's morbid, sure, but also very practical from a business standpoint. Waste not, want not, I suppose. The really famous executioners even built serious reputations as healers. There are records of people traveling significant distances to see a particular executioner because he was known for his skill with broken bones or his effective saves. Some executioners published medical manuals. They became minor celebrities in the healing world, which is just deeply ironic, considering they were also social outcasts who couldn't eat at the same table as regular people. Take the Nachtrichter family in Nuremberg, for example. The Nachtrichters were executioners for generations, and they also ran a thriving medical practice on the side. Franz Schmidt, probably the most famous of them, kept a detailed diary of his 45-year career. He recorded every single one of the executions and physical corrections he performed, and in between those entries are notes about patients he treated, broken legs, skin diseases, all sorts of ailments. He was apparently quite good at it too. People respected his medical skills even while they shunned him socially. It's this bizarre contradiction. The same hands that tied the noose also set your child's broken arm, and everyone just sort of accepted this because, well, what choice did they have? Proper university-trained physicians were expensive and rare. The executioner was right there. He knew what he was doing, and he charged reasonable rates. So you held your nose, figuratively and maybe literally, and you let him do his work. But medical stuff wasn't even close to the only side gig. Executioners also handled a lot of the jobs that fell under the category of extremely unpleasant and nobody else wants to do it. Sanitation work, for instance, cleaning out latrines, dealing with waste, clearing out cesspits. These were jobs that needed doing, especially in crowded medieval towns where sanitation was already pretty questionable. And since the executioner was already considered unclean, well, might as well have him handle the actual unclean work too. The logic was flawless, if deeply unfair.
Dead animals were another big part of the job. When a horse died, or a cow, or any large animal, someone had to deal with the carcass. That someone was usually the executioner. He'd haul it away, skin it if the hide was worth anything, and dispose of what was left. Sometimes he'd work directly with the town's knacker, who specialized in dead animal removal. Sometimes the executioner was the knacker. The jobs sort of blurred together. This also meant that executioners often had a side business in animal byproducts. They'd sell the hides, the fat, the bones. Nothing went to waste. It was a whole little economy of death and refuse, and the executioner was right in the middle of it. Some executioners also ran or were associated with brothels, because of course they were. Sex work was another one of those dishonorable professions, so it made a certain kind of sense that the people involved would end up clustered together, socially speaking. In some towns, the executioner was responsible for overseeing the brothel, making sure the workers followed local regulations, collecting fines when they didn't. It was law enforcement, sort of, but the kind that kept you firmly in the dishonorable category. Then there were the odd jobs that came up specifically because of the executioner's unique position. He might be called on to torture someone during an interrogation. That was actually a pretty regular part of the job, more regular than actual proceedings in many cases. Torture wasn't seen as punishment back then. It was seen as a way to get at the truth, to force a confession, and the executioner was the guy with the tools and the knowledge to make it happen. He'd also sometimes be responsible for displaying the bodies after proceedings or parts of bodies as a warning to others, heads on pikes, that sort of thing. Maintaining these displays, making sure they stayed visible and, suitably grim, that was part of the job description. In some places, executioners collected tolls at bridges or city gates. They'd be given this job as a way to supplement their income,
and it reinforced their role as enforcers of civic order. Pay your toll to the guy who might someday be putting you in the stocks. It's a great incentive system, really. The payment structure for executioners was actually pretty complicated and often kind of terrible. They usually received a small salary from the town or the local lord, but it often wasn't enough to live on. So they relied heavily on these side jobs and on fees for specific services. Every time they performed their official duties, there was a fee schedule. So much for a beheading, less for a hanging, a certain amount for flogging or branding. The fees varied by region and by the status of the condemned person. Sometimes the executioner got to keep the clothes and possessions of the person he'd just dealt with. That was considered part of his payment. So there's this grim image of the executioner going through the pockets of the deceased, claiming a shirt here, a pair of shoes there. They might also get payments in kind, a certain amount of grain each year, firewood, the right to graze an animal on common land. It was a patchwork income, inconsistent and unreliable, which is why all those side jobs were so important. You couldn't support a family on the occasional proceeding alone. And yes, these guys had families. They married, had children, lived in houses, but those families were also marked by the dishonorable status. An executioner's daughter couldn't marry a respectable tradesman. An executioner's son would likely become an executioner himself, or take up some other dishonorable trade, because those were basically the only options available. In fact, executioner families often formed dynasties. The job was hereditary in many places, passed from father to son, sometimes for generations. You'd have these families where everyone knew that's what they were, the executioner family. They'd live in a house on the edge of town, literally outside the town walls or in some marginal space. They'd socialize mainly with each other and with other dishonorable people. It was a whole separate social world. The living arrangements were part of the stigma. Executioners couldn't live just anywhere. They were often assigned a specific house, and it was usually in an undesirable location, near the gallows maybe, or by the town dump, or just outside the main settlement. The message was clear: you're necessary, but you're not one of us. Their houses sometimes doubled as their workshops. They'd store their tools there, prepare their equipment, maybe even conduct some of their side business activities. The executioner's house was a known location, a place people would go to when they needed his services, whether that was an official proceeding or a dislocated shoulder. Despite all the stigma, or maybe because of it, executioners developed a strong sense of professional identity. They took pride in their work, maintained their tools carefully, honed their skills. A clean, quick beheading was a matter of professional honor. Bungling it was shameful and could damage your reputation, such as it was. They also had their own professional networks. Executioners from different towns would know each other, correspond, sometimes help each other out. If a town didn't have an executioner, they might borrow one from a neighboring town. There are records of executioners traveling to perform specific jobs, almost like medieval freelancers. And the skills required were actually pretty significant. It's not like just anyone could do this work. You needed a steady hand, good judgment, physical strength, and a certain amount of psychological fortitude. The medical knowledge was genuinely useful. The ability to judge a crowd and maintain order during a public proceeding, that mattered too. These were skilled professionals, even if society treated them like contaminated outcasts. The tools of the trade were carefully maintained. Swords and axes had to be sharp, ropes had to be strong, stocks and pillories had to be in good repair. The executioner was responsible for all of this. He'd spend time sharpening blades, testing equipment, making sure everything would work properly when the time came.
because nothing was worse for everyone involved than equipment failure at a critical moment. Some executioners were also responsible for the town's instruments of public shaming and punishment: the stocks, the pillory, the ducking stool, the whipping post. These needed maintenance, and that was often the executioner's job. So he'd be out there, making sure the stocks still locked properly, that the whipping post was firmly planted, just casual medieval carpentry between the more dramatic moments. The relationship between the executioner and the community was deeply complicated. People needed him, but they didn't want to need him. They'd use his services, both official and unofficial, but they'd maintain strict social distance. You wouldn't shake his hand. You wouldn't invite him to your wedding. Your kids wouldn't play with his kids. There were all sorts of rules and customs around this. In some places, if an executioner touched you in the market, you could demand compensation. His touch was considered polluting. He might have to use a special entrance into buildings. He definitely couldn't join a guild or hold public office beyond his own grim position. But here's the thing. People also kind of feared executioners in a superstitious way. They were seen as having dark knowledge, connections to death and the underworld. Those healing powers they supposedly had, part of that came from the belief that they had some kind of supernatural connection. They dealt with death so regularly that they must understand its mysteries. This meant that while executioners were shunned, they were also sometimes consulted for things that went beyond the physical. Love potions, curses, protection against evil. The executioner existed in this liminal space between the normal world and something darker, and people sometimes wanted access to that, even while they kept him at arm's length the rest of the time.
Children were probably told to stay away from the executioner's house. It became this boogeyman location. Behave or you'll end up at the executioner's, that sort of thing. But then when an adult actually needed something only the executioner could provide, they'd swallow their pride and knock on that same door. The weird thing is that some executioners became relatively wealthy, despite the social stigma. If you were good at your job, if you built up a medical practice, if you managed your side businesses well, you could actually accumulate money and property, but you still couldn't buy your way into respectability. An executioner could own land and live in a decent house and have savings, and he'd still be banned from the taverns as the poorest but honorable beggar. Money didn't wash away dishonor. Status was fixed in a way that economic class wasn't. You could be a rich executioner and you'd still be outside the bounds of polite society. Your grandchildren would still carry the stain. It was remarkably rigid. There are records of executioners trying to retire from the profession and take up other trades, only to be blocked by guilds and communities. Once an executioner, always an executioner, at least in the eyes of society. The mark was permanent. Some executioners did manage to transition their families into respectability, but it usually took generations and required moving to a new place where the family history wasn't known. You'd have an executioner's grandson who moved to a different town, took up a regular trade, kept quiet about his background, and slowly, painfully, his descendants might work their way back into the honorable classes. But it was a long, difficult process. Let me give you a sense of what a typical day might look like for a medieval executioner on one of the many days when he wasn't performing his namesake duty. He'd wake up in his house, probably on the outskirts of town. Maybe he'd check his tools first thing, just routine maintenance. Sharpen a blade, oil some metal, inspect the ropes. This would be as natural as a baker checking his ovens. Then maybe someone shows up at the door.
a farmer with a badly broken finger. The executioner sets it, wraps it, sells the farmer some salve, collects a small fee. The farmer doesn't quite meet his eyes, but mumbles a thank you and leaves. Mid-morning, a message from the town council. A dead horse needs removing from one of the main streets. It's blocking traffic and starting to smell. The executioner sighs because this is going to be heavy, unpleasant work, but it's also part of the job. He hauls his cart over, gets the horse loaded with help from his assistant, maybe a son or an apprentice, and drags it off to wherever dead horses go. He'll skin it later, sell the hide, maybe render some of the fat. Afternoon, he's back at the house working on his various concoctions. He's making more of that salve because it sells well. The recipe includes some herbs, some animal fat, maybe some other ingredients he keeps to himself. Trade secrets, even in this trade. Late afternoon, a visit from the bailiff. There's going to be a public punishment next week. Someone being put in the stocks for petty theft. The executioner needs to make sure the stocks are ready and be present to supervise. He makes a note, discusses the details, maybe negotiates his fee. Evening, he's at home with his family. They eat dinner together, probably apart from the rest of the town's social life. His wife might help with the medical business, preparing supplies, keeping records. His children are learning the trade, whether they want to or not, because what else are they going to do? It's a life. It's not glamorous, it's not exciting, but it's a life. And most of it has nothing to do with the thing he's actually named for. Now, let's talk about some specific examples, because the general overview is one thing, but the details are where it gets truly strange. There was this executioner in Nuremberg named Franz Schmidt, and I mentioned him briefly before, but he really deserves more attention because his diary is basically the only reason we know as much as we do about what these guys actually did day to day. Franz kept meticulous records for 45 years, from 1573 to 1617. And by meticulous, I mean he wrote down everything. Every single proceeding he performed, every punishment, every fine detail. But mixed in with all of that official business are these little glimpses of his regular life, his medical practice, his family, his frustrations with his social status. The whole thing is this fascinating window into a world that most people wanted to pretend didn't exist. Franz didn't want to be an executioner, which is relatable. His father was an executioner, so Franz was basically destined for the job, whether he liked it or not. He actually tried to become a barber surgeon instead, which was a respectable profession, but the guild wouldn't accept him because of his father's occupation, so back to the family business he went. The thing is, Franz was good at it, really good. He was known for clean, efficient work. He took pride in doing the job properly, minimizing suffering when possible, maintaining his professional standards, and his medical practice thrived. People came from all over to see him for broken bones and other injuries. He developed a genuine reputation as a healer. But it ate at him, the dishonor. You can see it in his diary. He wanted respectability so badly. He wanted his children to have opportunities he didn't have. And eventually, after decades of impeccable service, he petitioned the town council to officially restore his honor, to declare him and his family honorable again. And they did. In 1624, 7 years after he retired,
the Nuremberg Council officially declared Franz Schmidt and his descendants honorable. It was almost unheard of, but Franz had spent 45 years being absolutely perfect at his job, building relationships, proving himself indispensable. He'd played the long game, and he won. His son didn't have to become an executioner. The stain was lifted. It's actually kind of moving in a weird way. This man spent his entire adult life trying to wash away a mark he never asked for, and he finally succeeded. Of course, he had to wait until he was retired and elderly to see it happen, because why would anything come easy? But Franz was exceptional. Most executioners didn't get their honor restored. They just lived with the stigma and passed it on to their kids and hoped for the best. Let's drift over to France for a bit, because the French executioners had their own particular quirks. The executioner families in France were also dynastic, sometimes even more rigidly so than in the German states. The Sanson family, for instance, were executioners in Paris for generations. They executed people through the entire Ancien regime, through the Revolution, through Napoleon, all the way into the 1800s. That's 2 centuries of one family doing this job. And the Sansons were busy with all the same side work as their counterparts elsewhere, medical treatment especially. Charles-Jean-Baptiste Sanson, who was the executioner during the Revolution and therefore had an extremely busy few years, also maintained a medical practice, though one imagines he had less time for setting broken bones when he was dealing with the sheer volume of work the Revolution provided. But before the Revolution, during the calmer periods, the Sansons would absolutely have been doing all those other jobs, dealing with animal carcasses, handling sanitation issues, selling dubious medical supplies. The French executioners also had this tradition where they could claim a handful of grain from every sack sold at the market. It was called the droit de havage. Just a small amount, but it added up. Imagine being a grain merchant and having to pay a small tax to the executioner just because. Every market day, there he is, collecting his due. These little fees and rights were scattered all over the place. Executioners might have the right to a certain amount of wine from each barrel brought into town, or a cut of fish sold on Fridays, or wood from the town forest. It was this patchwork of small privileges that supplemented the actual salary, which, again, was usually pretty inadequate. In England, things were a bit different, because of course they were. English executioners were less likely to be permanent positions and more likely to be appointed on an as-needed basis. Sometimes they were just regular criminals who were offered a pardon in exchange for doing the work. Congratulations, you're not being hanged anymore. Instead, you get to be the one doing the hanging. What a promotion. But even in England, the people who did this work regularly still faced the same social stigma and still needed to make money on the side. They'd have similar side gigs, medical work, dealing with dead animals, collecting tolls, that sort of thing. The details varied, but the overall pattern was remarkably consistent across Europe.
One thing that's kind of darkly funny is how much the general population relied on executioners while simultaneously treating them as untouchable. Everyone needed the services these men provided, both official and unofficial, but nobody wanted to acknowledge that need publicly. Like, there are records of town councils arguing about executioner salaries. The council would try to pay as little as possible, and the executioner would point out, reasonably, that he can't live on this amount. He has a family, he has expenses, and the council would grudgingly agree to a tiny increase while also making it very clear that he should be grateful for the opportunity to serve the community. The hypocrisy is just breathtaking. Meanwhile, those same council members would absolutely visit the executioner privately when they needed a medical treatment they couldn't get elsewhere, or when they needed some unsavory job done quickly and quietly. The public disdain and private dependence existed side by side, and everyone just pretended not to notice the contradiction. The executioner's house became this strange sort of unofficial community resource. Need a broken bone set? Executioner's house. Dead cow in your field? Executioner's house. Weird growth that won't go away? Executioner's house. It was like a medieval catch-all for anything too unpleasant or too medical for regular society to handle. And the executioners adapted. They became entrepreneurs out of necessity. They couldn't just do one job and expect to survive, so they diversified. They built these little economic empires based on death, medicine, and filth. Some of them became legitimately wealthy doing it. There's this account from a German town in the 1600s where the executioner owned multiple properties, had investments in various businesses, and lived quite comfortably. But he still couldn't eat in a public tavern, still couldn't join the other successful men of the town in their social clubs, still had to use the back entrance at church. The money meant nothing to his social status. His wealth actually made some people resentful. How dare the executioner live better than honest tradesmen? Never mind that he'd earned that money through hard work and business sense. The dishonor was supposed to come with poverty, apparently. When it didn't, people got weird about it. Some towns tried to regulate what executioners could and couldn't do with their side businesses. You can do medical work, but only these specific types. You can sell salves, but not in the main market. You can collect tolls, but you have to stand in this specific spot while doing it. Everything was controlled and limited, keeping the executioner in his place, even as his services were being used.
The medical aspect of the job is really worth dwelling on a bit more, because it's so unexpected and yet so logical once you think about it. The executioner knew bodies. He understood anatomy in a practical, hands-on way that physicians who'd only studied books didn't. When someone broke a bone, the executioner knew exactly what that break looked like, how the pieces needed to fit back together, how much force to use to set it. And honestly, for a lot of common injuries and ailments, the executioner was probably a better bet than a university-trained physician. The physician would want to balance your humors, maybe bleed you, prescribe some complicated and expensive treatment based on theory. The executioner would just set your arm and send you home. There's something almost democratic about it. Rich people could afford fancy doctors. Poor people went to the executioner. And the poor people probably got more effective treatment in a lot of cases. Sure, the executioner's salves might contain some questionable ingredients, and his methods were rough, but at least he knew what he was doing in practical terms. The whole corpse medicine thing, though, that's the part that really gets weird. This wasn't just a niche superstition. This was mainstream belief across much of Europe for centuries. The human body, especially a body that died by violence, was thought to contain powerful healing properties, and executioners had access to fresh corpses on a regular basis. So they'd harvest blood, fat, bones, flesh. Different parts were thought to cure different things. Executioners would sell these materials, sometimes raw, sometimes processed into medicines. There are recipes that include things like moss grown on a skull or fat from a hanged man, just casual ingredient lists from a nightmare. And people bought this stuff. They used it. They believed in it. The executioner was essentially running a boutique pharmaceutical operation based entirely on human remains. It's absolutely macabre, but it was also just part of the medical landscape of the time. The funny thing is, some of those remedies probably did work, not because of anything magical about executed criminals, but because of other ingredients mixed in. That salve might contain human fat, but it also contained herbs and other materials that had genuine healing properties. So people would attribute the effectiveness to the gruesome ingredient, when really it was the chamomile or whatever doing the actual work.
But the executioner wasn't going to correct that misunderstanding, because the mystique was part of his business model. Let people think the human fat is what makes it work. Charge accordingly. It's just good business, in a deeply disturbing kind of way. Animal work was less dramatic, but probably took up more time. Dead livestock was a constant issue in medieval towns. Animals died. They died in inconvenient places. Someone had to move them, and that someone was usually the executioner. He'd have a cart specifically for this purpose, just a dead animal cart, one of several tools of his trade. When the call came, he'd haul the cart over, load up whatever had died, and remove it from public view. Then he'd process it, salvaging anything useful, disposing of the rest. The hides could be sold, though executioner-processed hides were considered inferior and sold for less than hides processed by regular tanners, because of course even the leather was tainted by association. But it was still income. The fat could be rendered down and used for various purposes: soap, candles, those medical salves we keep talking about. The bones might be sold to craftsmen who worked with bone, though again they'd pay less because of the source. Some executioners kept dogs to help with this work, and the dogs themselves became sort of marked, the executioner's dogs. People wouldn't want them near their own animals. Everything associated with the executioner became tainted by extension. The same went for his family. An executioner's wife couldn't be a midwife in most places, even though that would be a natural fit given the family's medical knowledge. Midwifery was one of those professions that required a spotless reputation. Can't have a dishonored woman bringing babies into the world. So the wife would help with the husband's work, preparing medicines, keeping records, managing the household economy. Some executioners' wives became skilled in their own right, knowing just as much about bone setting and salves as their husbands, but they couldn't practice independently. The stigma wouldn't allow it. Children of executioners had it particularly rough. They didn't choose this life, but they were born into it. They carried the mark from birth. Other children weren't supposed to play with them. They couldn't apprentice to respectable trades. Their marriage prospects were limited to other dishonored families. Imagine being a kid and understanding that your father's job, which he might be quite good at and take pride in, means you're automatically excluded from normal life. You can't be friends with the baker's son. You can't learn carpentry. You can't marry the girl you like because her family would never allow it. Your future is decided before you're old enough to understand what's happening. Some children of executioners ran away, tried to start over somewhere else under a different name. Sometimes it worked. More often, they were found out and sent back, or they ended up in even worse situations because they had no support system. Others embraced the family business, figured if they were going to be stuck with the stigma anyway, might as well learn the trade. Executioner dynasties were built on this resignation, generation after generation doing the work, because what else was there? And the thing is, the work itself required genuine skill and training. It's not like you could just hand someone an axe and say good luck. A botched proceeding was horrific for everyone involved. The executioner needed to know exactly where to strike, how much force to use, how to read a crowd, how to handle unexpected situations. Apprenticeships were real. An executioner would train his son or nephew or some other young man from a dishonored family, teaching him the craft, how to maintain equipment, how to prepare for different types of proceedings, how to manage the public spectacle, how to run the side businesses. It was education, just in a field nobody wanted to acknowledge. Some executioners traveled to learn from others, improving their technique, learning new methods. There was a professional community, such as it was. They'd correspond, share advice, sometimes meet at regional gatherings. These men were isolated in their home communities, but connected to each other across distances. Letters between executioners still exist in some archives. They're surprisingly mundane. Discussions of technique, yes, but also talk of family, business, local politics, just regular professional correspondence between colleagues, except the profession in question was one that everyone else preferred to ignore. The equipment itself was a significant investment. A good sword was expensive. It had to be perfectly balanced, sharp, maintained. The executioner owned his tools and was responsible for their upkeep. In some places, the town provided certain equipment, but often it was personal property, passed down through families. And yes, the swords had names sometimes, because of course they did. Medieval people named their weapons, and executioners were no exception. There are records of execution swords with names engraved on the blade: Blutfuchs, blood fox, Wiedergeld, retribution, just in case the sword was already ominous enough. The maintenance routine would be regular: sharpening, oiling, checking the balance. A dull blade was unthinkable. It would turn a quick proceeding into a nightmare. So the executioner would spend time, probably more time than he actually spent using the thing, keeping it in perfect condition. Ropes had to be inspected for wear, replaced when necessary. Wooden equipment had to be checked for rot or damage. The pillory needed to lock properly. The whipping post needed to be stable. All of this was ongoing work, not dramatic or interesting, just necessary maintenance. And when there wasn't maintenance to do, when there were no medical patients, no dead animals to haul, no sanitation emergencies, the executioner might just sit around like anyone else. Maybe he had a garden. Maybe he kept some chickens. Maybe he had hobbies that had nothing to do with his job. There are hints in various records that executioners were people with regular interests. One might be known for his skill at woodworking. Another bred particularly good hunting dogs. Another played an instrument. They were whole human beings, not just walking embodiments of their profession, but society rarely saw them that way. The isolation must have been crushing at times, to be necessary but unwanted, to provide services everyone needed but to be excluded from the community you served, to watch your children suffer for choices you didn't really make. It's a special kind of social cruelty, and it was just accepted as normal for centuries. Let's float over to some other parts of Europe for a bit, because the executioner experience wasn't exactly uniform across the continent. Different regions had their own particular flavors of this whole situation. In Spain, for instance, executioners were called verdugos, and they dealt with the same social stigma, but with some extra complications thrown in by the Inquisition. Because why not add religious persecution to an already complex job description? The Inquisition had its own procedures and its own officials, but local executioners were sometimes called in to assist. This meant navigating not just civil law, but also church politics, which sounds absolutely exhausting. Spanish executioners also did the usual side work: medical treatments, animal disposal, sanitation.
But they had an additional role in some regions as public criers or town announcers. They'd walk through the streets announcing news, proclamations, upcoming events. So the same guy who might put you in the stocks next week was also the one telling you about the holiday market. The cognitive dissonance must have been something. In Italy, things got even more fragmented because Italy wasn't a unified country. You had all these city-states and regions, each with their own rules and customs. The executioner in Venice had a very different experience from the executioner in Naples. Some Italian executioners were more integrated into civic life than their counterparts elsewhere. In certain cities, they could own shops, conduct business more openly, live closer to the center of town. But the underlying stigma was still there. They might be more tolerated, but they weren't exactly welcomed into the social elite. It was stigma with slightly better real estate, basically. In Venice specifically, executioners were employed by the state and had certain protections. The position came with a salary, housing, and specific duties. But Venetian executioners also ran what were essentially processing houses for criminals. They'd oversee imprisonment conditions, manage the logistics of punishment, handle all the administrative work that went along with the justice system. It was bureaucratic in a way that other regions weren't. Eastern Europe had its own variations. In Poland and the territories that would eventually become Germany, the role was similar to what we've already discussed, but there were additional complications around religion and ethnicity. Jewish communities sometimes had to arrange their own proceedings according to their own laws, which meant different systems operating in parallel. The interaction between these systems and the Christian executioners was complex and often contentious. Russian executioners, or katov, existed in a slightly different social framework because the whole structure of Russian society was different. Serfdom, the Orthodox Church, the particular flavor of autocracy. But they still ended up doing similar side work because the fundamental problem was the same. You can't make a living off occasional proceedings alone. Let's talk about the religious aspect more, because the church's relationship with executioners was fascinatingly hypocritical. The church taught that proper authority included the right to punish wrongdoers, even unto death. The state's power to execute was seen as divinely ordained, so the executioner was, in theory, carrying out God's justice. But at the same time, the executioner was tainted by his work. He dealt in death and blood, which were spiritually polluting. He couldn't take communion in the same way as other people in some regions. He had to sit separately in church. Some stricter interpretations held that an executioner couldn't be buried in consecrated ground, though this varied widely. So the church simultaneously endorsed the necessity of the work and condemned the person doing it. The executioner was a tool of divine justice who couldn't fully participate in the church's sacraments. It's the kind of logical pretzel that medieval theology excelled at creating. Some executioners were deeply religious despite these restrictions. Franz Schmidt, our friend from Nuremberg, was apparently quite pious. He saw his work as a sacred duty, doing God's will by removing evil from society. He went to church regularly, even though he had to sit in the dishonored section. He prayed, kept religious objects, raised his children in the faith. But other executioners became cynical about religion, which is understandable. If the church is going to tell you that you're doing necessary work and then refuse you full participation in spiritual life, you might develop some complicated feelings about the whole institution. There were cases of executioners who refused to participate in proceedings that they felt were unjust. Religious conviction sometimes gave them the moral framework to push back against authority. This was risky because defying the town council or the local lord could cost you your position, and then what? But it happened.
One German executioner in the 1500s refused to proceed with an order because he believed the accused was innocent. He was fired, lost his house, had to move to another territory and start over, but he apparently felt it was worth it. His religious beliefs wouldn't allow him to participate in what he saw as murder rather than justice. The irony of an executioner drawing that particular moral line is rich, but also kind of admirable in its way. The church also complicated the economics of the job. In Catholic regions, there were more feast days, more restrictions on when you could work. An executioner couldn't perform his duties on major holy days. This was actually a problem sometimes, because legal proceedings had schedules and timelines. If someone was supposed to be punished but the date fell on a religious festival, everything had to be rescheduled. This meant more waiting, more uncertainty, more time when the executioner wasn't earning fees. The religious calendar directly impacted his income. And of course, the executioner still had to observe all the same religious restrictions as everyone else in terms of fasting and feast day observance, but without the same access to religious comfort and community. Some clergy developed relationships with sympathetic clergy, a priest or monk who saw past the social stigma and recognized the executioner's humanity. These relationships must have been precious, a rare source of spiritual support in an otherwise isolating existence. There are records of clergy who specifically ministered to executioners and their families, which was controversial but also kind of beautiful. Other clergy wouldn't go near an executioner except in the most official capacity. They'd perform the necessary religious rituals around proceedings because that was required, but they'd keep maximum distance otherwise. Some priests apparently saw executioners as spiritually dangerous, like their taint might rub off. Let's drift back to the daily economics, because there's more to unpack there. The side businesses weren't just random odd jobs, they were carefully cultivated income streams that required real business sense. Take the medical practice. An executioner couldn't just hang out a shingle and wait for patients. He had to build a reputation. Word of mouth was everything. If you successfully treated someone's broken leg and they could walk again, they'd tell others. Slowly, you'd build up a client base.
But you also had to be careful not to fail too publicly. A botched medical treatment could tank your reputation just as badly as a bungled proceeding. People were already looking for reasons to distrust you. One bad outcome, and suddenly you're not just dishonored, you're also incompetent. So executioners who succeeded at the medical side of things were genuinely skilled. They had to be better than the competition, or at least effective enough that people would overcome their revulsion to use their services. This meant ongoing learning, experimentation, keeping up with new techniques. Some executioners had access to medical texts. They'd learn to read specifically to study medical knowledge. Others learned from other executioners or from physicians who were willing to share information. The knowledge network was real, even if informal. The salves and ointments they produced had to actually work, or at least appear to work. This meant ingredients, ratios, preparation methods. It was chemistry, basically. Medieval, superstition-laden chemistry with questionable ingredients, but still a form of applied science. And the marketing. Executioners had to market themselves.
carefully without overstepping the social boundaries. You couldn't advertise too openly because that would be presumptuous, but you needed people to know what services you offered. It was a delicate balance. The animal carcass business had its own economics. An executioner might have arrangements with knackers, tanners, soap makers. He'd supply them with raw materials, they'd pay him a set rate. It was a supply chain, with the executioner as a key node. Some executioners cut out the middlemen and processed materials themselves. They'd render fat, cure hides, prepare bones. This required equipment, space, and knowledge, but it meant keeping more of the profit. Of course, it also meant more work and more smell, which wasn't great when you already lived on the margins of town.
The smell must have been intense. Between the animal processing, the medical ingredients, the general atmosphere of the work, an executioner's house probably had a distinctive odor. This was yet another marker of difference, another way the community could identify and avoid them. Seasonality affected the work too. Summer meant more disease, which meant more medical patients, but also more dead animals to deal with. Heat and decomposition don't mix well. Winter was probably slower for both medical work and animal issues, but it brought its own challenges: keeping warm, maintaining equipment in cold weather, dealing with the economic slowdown. Harvest time meant lots of activity in town, which could mean more petty crime, which could mean more proceedings and punishments. But it also meant less time for the executioner's side work, because everyone else was focused on bringing in crops. The rhythm of the agricultural year shaped the executioner's calendar just like everyone else's. Festivals and fairs were complicated times. On one hand, more people meant more potential customers for medical services and more opportunity for income. On the other, executioners were often excluded from participating in festivals in the same way as regular people. They might work the festival, providing security or overseeing order, but they couldn't enjoy it. There are accounts of executioners who had to be present at public celebrations to handle anyone who got too drunk or disorderly, essentially serving as medieval bouncers. They'd stand there, watching everyone else have fun, ready to step in if needed. Sounds delightful. Public festivals were also when public punishments were sometimes scheduled. Nothing like a good flogging to really set the party mood. The executioner would have to perform in front of larger crowds than usual, which meant more pressure to do everything perfectly, more eyes watching, more chances for something to go wrong. The crowd management aspect of the job was significant. Public proceedings were public entertainment, basically. People would turn out in large numbers, pack into the square, jostle for the best view. The executioner had to maintain control of this situation while also performing his actual duties. If the crowd got unruly, if they decided they disagreed with the sentence, things could get dangerous fast. There are cases of mobs rushing forward to free a condemned person, or, alternatively, rushing forward to tear them apart before the official proceedings could happen. The executioner was right in the middle of this potential chaos. He'd usually have assistants or guards to help, but he was still the focal point, the person everyone was watching, the one who had to project authority and control, even while being socially subordinate to basically everyone present. Some executioners developed a kind of showmanship. They'd make a performance of it, draw out the tension, play to the crowd. This sounds grotesque, and it was, but it was also a survival skill.
Keep the crowd engaged and controlled, and everyone gets home safely. Other executioners were more perfunctory. Just do the job, no theatrics, get it over with. This was probably less satisfying for spectators, but also less likely to go wrong. Different professional styles for different personalities. The assistants that executioners employed were another aspect of the job that doesn't get talked about much. An executioner often couldn't do everything alone. He needed help with heavy work, crowd control, equipment management. These assistants were usually family members or other men from dishonored backgrounds. Being an executioner's assistant was its own job with its own stigma. You got tainted by association even if you never actually performed proceedings yourself. But it was employment, and for men who had limited options, it was sometimes the best available choice. These assistants would do a lot of the grunt work, hauling carcasses, preparing equipment, running errands. They'd learn the trade, and often they'd eventually become executioners themselves in other towns. It was a career path, grim as that sounds.
The relationship between an executioner and his assistants could be complicated. There was hierarchy, but also camaraderie, born of shared exclusion. They were in this together, bound by their collective dishonor. Some executioners treated their assistants well, almost like family. Others were harsh taskmasters. Human nature played out even in these marginal spaces. Let's talk about clothing for a minute, because what executioners wore mattered symbolically. In some regions, executioners had to wear specific colors or markers to identify them. Red, symbolizing blood; black, symbolizing death; yellow, which was associated with shame and exclusion. These clothing requirements meant that an executioner was always visually identifiable. You could see him coming. You could avoid him if you wanted. The clothing marked him as surely as a brand. Some executioners had official uniforms for performing their duties. These might be provided by the town, or the executioner might make them himself. The uniform served to emphasize the official nature of the work, to separate the executioner as person from the executioner as office. In daily life, clothing regulations varied. Some places required executioners to always wear their identifying colors. Others only required it when they were performing official duties. When he was just going about his regular business, the executioner might dress normally, though people would still recognize him. There's something particularly cruel about forcing someone to wear identifying clothing based on their profession. It removes any possibility of anonymity, any chance to just be a person in a crowd. You're always the executioner, always marked, always visible. Some executioners pushed back against these requirements. There are records of disputes where an executioner refused to wear the prescribed clothing, arguing that he should be allowed to dress as he pleased. Usually, he lost these arguments, because of course he did. The homes executioners lived in were often marked as their clothing. In some towns, the executioner's house was painted a specific color, or it had a particular sign. The gallows symbol was sometimes used. Anything to make absolutely sure everyone knew who lived there. These houses were typically on the edge of town, as I mentioned before, near the town walls or outside them entirely, near the gallows or the place of punishment, near the river, downstream from everyone else. Marginal spaces for marginal people. But the executioner's house was also a known location for people who needed his services. There's that contradiction again. We're going to mark your house and put it in the worst location,
but also everyone needs to know where to find you when they need you. Some executioner houses were quite large because they had to accommodate the work. Space for storing equipment, space for medical work, space for processing animal carcasses or preparing salves, space for the family. It wasn't unusual for an executioner to have a bigger house than many respectable tradesmen, which probably caused resentment. The yard around the house would be used for various work activities. You might have a workspace for messy tasks, a place to store wood or other materials, maybe a garden. Some executioners kept animals, chickens or pigs like anyone else. But again, everything was tainted by association. The executioner's chickens were seen as different from other chickens. Would you want to buy eggs from the executioner? Would you trust that they were clean, untainted? Probably not, which meant the executioner's family had to consume their own eggs rather than selling them. This extended to everything they produced. The executioner's wife might be an excellent baker, but could she sell bread at the market? Not likely. She might be skilled at sewing, but who would buy clothes stitched by dishonored hands? The family had to be largely self-sufficient because their participation in the normal economy was limited. They couldn't buy and sell freely like other people. This was one more way the stigma created practical hardship on top of the social exclusion. Children of executioners must have felt this keenly. Imagine being a kid and understanding that the bread your mother makes, which is just as good as any other bread, can't be sold because of who your father is. The unfairness of it would be obvious even to a child. Some executioner families tried to work around these restrictions. They'd have friends or associates who were willing to sell goods on their behalf, taking a cut of the profit. It was a gray market, technically allowed, but socially questionable. Other families just accepted the isolation and built their lives around it. They'd develop their own little economy, trading among other dishonored families, creating a parallel social world. Executioner families, knacker families, tanner families, they'd all intermarry and trade among themselves. This created something almost like a separate caste. Generations of families who only socialized with each other, who married within their group, who passed down their trades and their stigma together. It was remarkably rigid. And yet, people from this caste provided essential services to the wider society. The waste had to be managed, the dead animals had to be removed, the punishments had to be carried out, the leather had to be tanned. But the people doing this work had to be kept at arm's length. It's a system that simultaneously relied on and rejected a whole category of people. The cognitive dissonance is remarkable, but it persisted for centuries, which tells you something about how deeply embedded these ideas were.
Let's think about what happened when an executioner retired, because that was its own complicated situation. If you'd been an executioner for decades, you couldn't just stop and become something else. The stigma didn't go away when you put down your tools. Some executioners worked until they were physically unable to continue. Then they'd live off whatever savings they'd accumulated, supplemented maybe by their medical practice if they could still do that, or they'd be supported by a son who'd taken over the position. The hereditary nature of the job meant that retirement could be a smooth transition. Father trains son. Son gradually takes over the work. Father steps back but stays involved in the medical and business side. Eventually, father becomes too old or infirm, and the son is fully in charge. But what if you didn't have a son? Or what if your son refused the work, or was incapable of it? Then you had a problem. The town needed an executioner, but the line of succession was broken. Sometimes a nephew or son-in-law would step in. Sometimes the town would recruit from another dishonored family. Sometimes they'd bring in an executioner from another town. The logistics could get complicated. And the retiring executioner would be left in a precarious position. He might get a small pension from the town if he'd served long and well. More likely, he'd have to rely on whatever he'd saved and whatever family support he had. There are a few cases of executioners who managed to save enough to live comfortably in retirement. They'd bought property, invested in businesses, built up a nest egg, but they still couldn't escape their identity. A retired executioner was still an executioner in everyone's eyes. Some moved away, tried to start over in places where they weren't known. An old man moving to a new town, keeping quiet about his past, hoping to live out his final years in something resembling peace. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the past caught up anyway. Death and burial were their own complications. The restriction on consecrated ground varied by region and by era, but it was always a concern. Would the executioner be allowed a proper Christian burial? Would a priest perform the rites? In practice, most executioners were buried eventually, because the church was never quite willing to fully commit to the logical extreme of its position. But the burial might be in a separate area of the graveyard, or at an odd time, or with minimal ceremony. For men who saw themselves as good Christians doing difficult but necessary work, this final exclusion must have stung. Your whole life you served society, you went to church, you raised your family in the faith, and at the end you still might be buried like an outcast. Some executioners made provisions in their wills for their burial, specifying exactly what they wanted and setting aside money to make sure it happened. They knew they couldn't trust to charity or goodwill. Even in death, they had to plan around their stigma. The families left behind after an executioner's death faced their own challenges. If there was a son in the trade, the family might be secure. If not, the widow and any unmarried daughters were in a difficult position. They carried the dishonor, but no longer had the income. Executioner widows sometimes ran the medical practice on their own for a while. They had the knowledge, the supplies, the established clientele. But they couldn't do the official executioner work, so the town would need to find a replacement for that. This could lead to complicated arrangements where the widow ran the informal business while a new executioner handled the official duties. Sometimes the new executioner would marry the widow, keeping everything in the family and ensuring continuity. Medieval pragmatism at its finest. Daughters of executioners had particularly limited options. They could marry another executioner or someone from another dishonored trade. They could remain unmarried and help with the family business. They could try to enter a convent, though many convents wouldn't accept them because of their background. Running away and trying to pass as someone else was always an option, but it meant cutting all ties to family and living in constant fear of discovery. Some women did it anyway.
The desire for a normal life was strong enough to risk everything. Sons had it slightly better in that they could at least continue the family trade and have a clear role. But that meant accepting a lifetime of stigma, giving up any dreams they might have had for a different life. Some rebelled. There are scattered records of executioners' sons who refused the trade and ran away, or who tried to fight the system. Most failed. The structures were too strong, the alternatives too limited. But occasionally, very occasionally, someone succeeded in breaking out. They'd get help from a sympathetic patron, or they'd have enough money to buy their way into a different life, or they'd move far enough away that their background didn't follow them. These success stories were rare enough to be noteworthy when they happened. The whole system started to break down eventually, of course. Social changes in the 1700s and 1800s gradually eroded the strict honor-dishonor divide. Enlightenment ideas about human dignity and rational social organization made the old stigmas seem increasingly absurd.
Towns started to question why they were treating essential workers as outcasts. The economic irrationality of it became more obvious. If a man is skilled and useful, why limit him what he can do? Why force him to the margins when he could contribute more if he were integrated? The practice of proceedings itself started to change. There was more concern for humane methods, more privacy around the process. Public spectacles became less common. The executioner's role shifted from public performer to state employee, carrying out an unfortunate necessity. By the 1800s, in many places, executioners were more like regular government workers. They had salaries, pensions, defined duties. The stigma persisted in social attitudes, but the legal and institutional barriers started to fall away. Some of the side businesses became less necessary or less possible. Medical care was professionalizing. You couldn't just be a self-taught bone setter anymore, not if you wanted to be taken seriously. The executioner's medical practice gradually faded as a thing. Animal disposal and sanitation became separate municipal functions. Towns hired specific people for these jobs rather than lumping them onto the executioner. Specialization was increasing across the economy. By the late 1800s and into the 1900s, the executioner was mostly just an executioner. The position still existed in many places, but it was narrower, more defined, less connected to all those other stigmatized jobs. And then, eventually, in most places, the position disappeared entirely, as states abolished proceedings or reduced them to such rare events that they didn't need a full-time specialist. The last executioner families passed out of the trade. Some disappeared into regular society, their descendants today probably having no idea about their ancestors' profession. Others maintained the family history as a point of curiosity or even pride. My great-great-grandfather was an executioner makes for an interesting conversation starter, at least.
But back in the medieval and early modern period, during the centuries when this system was at its peak, executioners lived these strange, contradictory lives, essential but excluded, skilled but stigmatized, providers of necessary services but forced to the margins. They developed elaborate side businesses to survive. They became medical practitioners, animal handlers, sanitation workers, toll collectors. They ran parallel economies and formed their own social networks. They raised families and maintained professional standards despite being treated as social contaminants. It's this weird, dark corner of history that most people don't think about. When we picture medieval life, we might think of knights and castles, or maybe peasants farming. We don't usually think about the executioner in his house on the edge of town, spending his Tuesday morning setting someone's broken finger and his afternoon hauling a dead cow out of the market square. But that was the reality. Most of an executioner's time was not spent executing people. It was spent doing all the other jobs that kept body and soul together, that paid the bills, that filled the long stretches between official duties. It was spent navigating social stigma, making economic opportunities out of marginal positions, building lives in the spaces that society grudgingly allowed. It was spent being a person with a particularly difficult job and all the complications that came with it. And through it all, they had to maintain their tools, keep their skills sharp, be ready when they were called upon to perform that duty that gave them their name and their stigma. The execution might be rare, but it defined everything else. The irony is that the actual proceedings were probably the least interesting part of the executioner's life, at least from a day-to-day perspective. They were dramatic, sure, but they were also just part of the job. The rest of it, the grinding daily work of survival in a hostile social environment, that's where the real story is.
Medieval executioners were entrepreneurs, medical practitioners, family men, skilled craftsmen, social outcasts, and everything in between. They were complex people in impossible situations, doing what they had to do to survive, and maybe, if they were lucky or skilled or persistent enough, to build something resembling a decent life. They sat in the back of churches and prayed to the same God as everyone else. They loved their families and worried about their children's futures. They took pride in their work, even when that work brought them nothing but scorn. They were human, fully and completely, even when society tried its best to make them something else. And when they weren't executing people, which was most of the time, they were just trying to get by, like anyone else, with the small detail that their path to getting by involved dead animals and corpse medicine, and sitting in that stigmatized space between necessary and despised. It's bleak in a lot of ways, but it's also kind of fascinating, the way people adapt to circumstances, the way they find paths forward even when every door seems closed. Medieval executioners had about as many doors closed to them as possible while still being nominally part of society. And yet, they persisted, generation after generation, building lives in the margins. So let's get into some more specific stories, because the individual cases really show you how strange and varied this whole situation could be. Each executioner had his own particular experience, his own way of navigating the system, his own personality that shaped how he dealt with the contradictions of his position. There was a man named Johann Michael Widmann who worked as an executioner in Bavaria in the early 1700s. Widmann kept records, not as detailed as Franz Schmidt's diary, but enough that we can piece together his life. And what's interesting about Widmann is how aggressively he pursued the medical side of the work. He didn't just set bones and sell the occasional salve. He built a full medical practice that rivaled any physician in the region.
He treated everything from minor injuries to chronic illnesses. He developed a reputation for being particularly good with childhood diseases, which is both touching and slightly unsettling given his primary profession. Parents would bring their sick children to the executioner's house. They'd wait in his front room, probably not trying to think too hard about what else happened in this building, while Widman examined their kids and prescribed treatments. And apparently he was good at it, because the practice thrived. Widman also wrote a medical manual. It was never officially published in his lifetime because, well, he was an executioner, and nobody wanted to publicly endorse medical advice from someone so dishonored. But the manuscript circulated. Other executioners copied it, used his remedies, built on his methods. He contributed to medical knowledge even while being excluded from official medical circles. The tragic part is that Widman desperately wanted recognition from the medical establishment. He wanted to be seen as a legitimate healer, not just the executioner who did medicine on the side. He wrote letters to physicians, offering to share his knowledge and learn from theirs. Most never responded. A few sent back polite but firm rejections. One apparently sent back a letter so scathing about Widman's presumption that Widman kept it, possibly as motivation or possibly just because he was a bit masochistic about the whole thing. Widman never got the recognition he wanted during his life. He died still marked as dishonored, still the executioner first and healer second in everyone's eyes. But his descendants eventually did manage to transition out of the trade. His grandson became a barber surgeon, then his great-grandson became a physician. Widman's medical knowledge passed down through the family until finally, 3 generations later, someone was allowed to practice it without stigma. There's something both sad and hopeful about that. Widman himself never escaped, but he built something that outlasted the stigma. His knowledge, his careful observations, his genuine desire to help people, all of that eventually bore fruit for his family, even though he never saw it. Then there's the case of an executioner in southern France whose name is recorded only as Arnaud. We know about Arnaud because he got into a massive legal dispute with his town council that generated a lot of documentation. The dispute was over his side businesses because apparently Arnaud was running quite the little empire. He had the medical practice, sure, he handled animal carcasses, but he also ran a tavern, which executioners weren't supposed to do. He owned rental properties. He invested in a mill. He was lending money at interest. This man was diversified. The town council decided this was too much. An executioner was supposed to know his place, and his place did not include being a successful businessman who owned half the properties on the west side of town. They tried to force him to divest, to stick to the traditional executioner side jobs and nothing more. Arnaud fought back. He argued quite reasonably that nothing in his contract specified what he could or couldn't do with his private time and money. If he wanted to invest in a mill, that was his business. If people were willing to drink at his tavern despite his profession, why should the council care? The legal battle went on for years. Multiple levels of courts got involved. Witnesses were called. Documents were produced. The whole thing became this beautiful piece of legal compromise. Arnaud won, sort of. The final ruling was this beautiful piece of legal compromise. He could keep his existing businesses, but he couldn't expand into new areas without approval. He had to sell the tavern, but he could keep the rental properties and the mill investment. He could continue lending money, but only to other dishonored people. It was a partial victory that acknowledged he had some rights while still keeping him firmly in his place. Arnaud apparently accepted the ruling and continued operating his business empire within the newly defined limits. The man understood how to play the long game. What I love about Arnaud's story is his sheer audacity. He looked at the system designed to keep him marginal and said, "Sure, but have you considered that I'm just going to ignore that and get rich anyway?" And then he actually did it. He used the gaps in the system, the fact that nobody had thought to explicitly forbid an executioner from owning rental properties, to build something substantial. His descendants, by the way, used that wealth to buy their way into respectability. Within 2 generations, the family name was clean. Money might not wash away dishonor directly, but it could purchase enough distance and new opportunities that eventually the stain faded. Let's talk about some of the women in execution of families, because they're usually invisible in the records, but they were absolutely part of this whole system. We know executioners had wives and daughters, but their stories are harder to find because they weren't the official office holders. But occasionally we get glimpses. There was a woman named Maria who was the wife of an executioner in Austria in the 1600s. We know about her because she gave testimony in a legal case about a medical treatment gone wrong. Someone had died after receiving one of the executioner's remedies, and the family was claiming negligence. In her testimony, Maria explained in detail how the remedies were made, who prepared them, and what the process was. And it becomes very clear from her testimony that Maria was doing most of the actual medical work. She was the one diagnosing patients, preparing the treatments, following up on their progress. Her husband was doing the official proceedings and the heavy animal work, but Maria was running the medical practice. The court ended up ruling that there was no negligence, that the patient had died of their underlying illness and not from the treatment. But Maria's testimony is this rare window into the reality of these households. The executioner's medical practice was often at least partly the executioner's wife's practice. These women had all the knowledge and did much of the work, but they couldn't claim credit because they were doubly marginalized, dishonored by association, and excluded from official recognition because they were women. If Maria had been born into a different family, she might have been a respected healer or midwife. Instead, she was the executioner's wife, helping with his side business, invisible to history, except for one court case. Daughters of executioners had their own particular struggles. There's a heartbreaking case from a town in what's now Germany from the early 1700s. An executioner's daughter named Elizabeth fell in love with a baker's apprentice. He apparently loved her too, and they wanted to marry. The Bakers' Guild found out and threatened to expel the apprentice if he went through with it. His master forbade it. His own family disowned him when he said he was going ahead anyway. The town council actually got involved, calling both young people in for a lecture about proper social boundaries. Elizabeth and the apprentice ran away together. They went to a different territory, tried to start over. But the guild system was interconnected. Word spread. The young man couldn't get work as a baker anywhere. They ended up destitute. We know the story because Elizabeth eventually came back home without the young man. There's a brief note in the town records about her return and her father taking her back in. No mention of what happened to the apprentice. No mention of whether Elizabeth ever got a chance at love again. Just a note that she was back, and that was that. How many stories like that happened? How many times did young people fall in love across the dishonor divide, only to be crushed by a system that valued social categories over human connection? We'll never know, because most of those stories didn't even leave the single note that Elizabeth's did. The system was cruel in its rigidity, and the thing is, everyone knew it was cruel, but cruelty in service of social order was considered acceptable, necessary even. Better to hurt a few individuals than to blur the lines that kept society organized.
Except the lines were arbitrary. The social order being protected was based on superstition and prejudice. But it was old superstition and prejudice, traditional and familiar, and that made it seem legitimate to people who didn't question it. Some executioners tried to challenge the system more directly. There was a man named Hans in a Swiss canton in the mid-1600s who petitioned repeatedly to have his honor restored. Unlike Franz Schmidt, who waited until retirement and had decades of perfect service, Hans tried to do it while still actively working. His argument was interesting. He said that since his work was ordained by God and the lawful authorities, it couldn't be dishonorable. He was carrying out divine and civic justice. Therefore, he should be treated with the same respect as any other servant of the law. The logic was solid. It used the same theological and legal principles that society claimed to uphold. But it didn't work. The authorities rejected his petition, and their reasoning basically came down to yes, but actually no. They acknowledged that his work was necessary and lawful. They agreed it was ordained by proper authority, but they said that didn't change the fundamental nature of the work as polluting. The contradiction didn't bother them at all. Hans kept petitioning for years. He was persistent. He gathered testimonials from people he'd helped medically, from town officials he'd served faithfully, from clergy who found him to be a good Christian. He built a case for his honor that would have been overwhelming for any other profession. Nothing changed. The system wouldn't bend. Hans died still dishonored, his petitions having accomplished exactly nothing except creating a paper trail that lets us know how deeply he felt the injustice. But here's the thing that's easy to miss. While some executioners were fighting the system, most were just living their lives, getting up in the morning, doing their work, coming home to their families. The stigma was there, constant and heavy, but it was also just the background of their existence. They celebrated births and mourned deaths. They had good days and bad days. They laughed at jokes and worried about money and got annoyed with their neighbors. They were people living people lives, just with this extra weight that never went away. A lot of the time, they probably weren't thinking about the grand injustice of their social position. They were thinking about whether they needed to buy more rope, or if that salve was ready to sell, or what was for dinner. The everyday stuff that occupies everyone's mind, regardless of circumstances. That's what makes it all so strange to think about. This huge, elaborate system of stigma and exclusion, and underneath it all were just regular people trying to get by. The system treated them as fundamentally other, but they were fundamentally the same as everyone else. Let's drift over to the topic of executioner guilds, because yes, that was a thing in some places. Even outcasts sometimes organized. In certain regions, executioners formed their own professional organizations, not guilds in the traditional sense because they were excluded from the official guild system, but associations that served similar purposes. They'd set standards, share knowledge, regulate who could enter the profession, provide mutual support. These organizations were informal and regional. Executioners from several neighboring towns would form a network. They'd meet periodically,
discuss professional matters, arrange training for new members. It was professionalization from below.
Some of these associations even set fee schedules, creating a kind of standardized price list for executioner services. This many coins for a beheading, this much for a flogging, standard rates for medical treatments. It kept anyone from undercutting the others and helped ensure everyone could make a living. The existence of these organizations shows that executioners thought of themselves as skilled professionals, regardless of how society categorized them. They had professional pride and professional standards. They just weren't allowed to express that through the normal channels. In a few cases, these executioner associations became quite formalized. There's one from southern Germany that had written bylaws, elected officers, and regular meetings. They kept records, maintained a fund to help members who fell on hard times, and even arbitrated disputes between executioners. It's almost funny. Society said these men were dishonorable and excluded them from normal civic structures. So they built their own structures, ran them probably better than some official guilds, and just carried on. The regular guilds must have hated it. Here were these outcasts, organizing and setting standards and acting like legitimate professionals. It undermined the whole premise that dishonored people were fundamentally lesser. But what were the guilds going to do? Ban executioners from forming associations? They were already banned from everything else. Complain to the authorities? The authorities needed the executioners to function and weren't about to interfere with them getting organized. So the executioner associations continued, existing in that same marginal space as everything else about the profession, not quite legal, not quite legitimate, but not forbidden either. Tolerated because suppressing them would be more trouble than it was worth. The transition out of the profession, which I touched on earlier, deserves more attention because it reveals a lot about how the system actually worked versus how it claimed to work.
In theory, dishonor was permanent and hereditary. An executioner's descendants would be tainted forever. In practice, there were ways out, difficult and expensive and time-consuming, but possible. The most common method was distance. Move far enough away that your family history wasn't known, and after a generation or two, you could slip into respectability. This required resources, though. You needed enough money to relocate, establish yourself in a new place, and support your family while building a new life. Poor executioner families couldn't do this. They were stuck. But successful ones, the ones who'd built up wealth through medical practices and side businesses, they had options. There's a pattern in the records of executioner families disappearing from one region, and suddenly there's a family of minor merchants or tradesmen in another region with a suspiciously similar name and arrival date. Nobody asked too many questions as long as you had money and kept quiet about your past. Education was another route out, though even more difficult. An executioner's son could somehow get educated, really educated. He might be able to transcend his birth. This meant finding a teacher willing to take on a dishonored student, which was rare. It meant having money for books and fees. It meant the student being exceptionally talented and persistent. But it happened. There are a handful of cases of executioners' sons who became clerks or secretaries, or even entered minor religious positions.
They had to be better than their competitors, had to overcome constant prejudice, had to probably hide their background or minimize it, but it was possible. Marriage was the trickiest route. If an executioner's daughter could marry someone from an honorable profession, and if that person's family and guild didn't object too strenuously, she could potentially wash away some of the stain. Her children would still be tainted, but less so. Her grandchildren might be nearly clean.
This required finding someone willing to marry down, socially speaking, and that usually meant the executioner's family bringing a substantial dowry to sweeten the deal. So again, it came down to money. The whole thing reveals how much social status could be negotiated despite all the claims about rigid hierarchy. If you had resources and patience and were willing to play the long game, you could work around even supposedly ironclad social rules. But most executioner families didn't have those resources. They stayed in the profession for generations because they had no choice. The successful transition stories are interesting, but they were the exception, not the rule. As we move into the 1700s and 1800s, the whole system started to shift in ways that changed the executioner's role fundamentally. The Enlightenment brought new ideas about reason, human dignity, and social organization. Thinkers started questioning whether traditional hierarchies made sense. The idea of dishonor based purely on occupation started to seem absurd to educated people. Why should a man be excluded from society because of the work he does, especially if that work is legal and necessary? The logic didn't hold up under rational scrutiny. Various German states started passing laws that declared that all lawful occupations were honorable. Executioners, knackers, tanners, gravediggers, everyone was now supposedly equal before the law. In practice, social attitudes changed much more slowly than legal status. The laws said executioners were honorable now, but good luck getting invited to dinner by the town's elite. The formal barriers fell, but the informal ones persisted. Still, it made a difference. An executioner's son could now legally join a guild. He might face discrimination, but he couldn't be rejected purely based on his father's profession. That was progress, slow and incomplete, but real. The medical side of the executioner's work started to fade during this same period. Medicine was professionalizing, becoming more scientific, more regulated. You needed formal training and credentials. The self-taught executioner healer didn't fit into this new model. Some executioners tried to adapt. They sought out formal medical training, tried to get credentials that would legitimize their practice. A few succeeded. Most found themselves shut out from the new professional medicine, just as they had been shut out from the old guild system. By the mid-1800s, executioner as doctor was largely a thing of the past. The medical practice that had sustained generations of executioners was being transferred to formally trained physicians, another income stream gone. Sanitation work was being municipalized. Cities were creating departments of public health, hiring specialized workers for waste management and animal removal. The executioner lost those jobs too. The role was narrowing, becoming just about the actual proceedings and associated punishments. And as penal reform movements grew, even that work was changing.
public proceedings became less common. There was more emphasis on imprisonment as punishment rather than physical correction or termination. Some places abolished proceedings entirely in the 1800s. Others kept it but performed it privately, behind prison walls, out of public view. The executioner went from a public performer to a prison employee doing unpleasant work in obscurity. The position became less viable as a profession. Towns that once employed a full-time executioner now only needed someone occasionally. The job became part-time, supplementary, eventually not a job at all in many places. By the early 1900s, the old medieval executioner was essentially gone. There were still people performing official proceedings in some places, but they were prison guards or state employees, not hereditary specialists carrying on a family trade. The last of the old executioner families either transitioned into other work or continued in a profession that was increasingly anachronistic. The stigma had faded enough that their children had options. The legal barriers were gone. The social barriers, while still present, were no longer insurmountable. And then even the name changed in a lot of places. Executioners started to seem too medieval, too theatrical. The new terms were bureaucratic, state agent, officer of justice, bland titles for a job that societies still needed occasionally, but no longer wanted to acknowledge in the same way. The whole tradition of the executioner as this specific, stigmatized but multifaceted profession just sort of dissolved. The function remained in some places, but the role, as it had existed for centuries, disappeared.
It's strange to think about. For hundreds of years, this was how society organized this particular necessity. Executioners were born into the role, trained in it, built elaborate side businesses around it, raised families within it, died still carrying its mark. And then, over the course of maybe 100 years, the whole system just unwound. Progress, I suppose, though it's worth noting that the progress came not from recognizing that stigmatizing these people was wrong, but that the role itself became less important. The stigma faded because the profession faded. Would it have gone away on its own if proceedings had remained central to the justice system? Maybe, maybe not. Looking back at the whole thing from our vantage point, the system seems bizarrely cruel and completely irrational. These were people doing necessary work, and society responded by making them and their families untouchable. The contradiction is glaring. But at the time, it made sense to people. The logic of pollution, of spiritual taint, of necessary hierarchy, all of that was just how the world worked. You didn't question it any more than you questioned the sun rising. The executioners themselves had to live with that. They couldn't step outside and see the system objectively. They were in it, subject to it, trying to make lives within its constraints. Some internalized it, believed they really were lesser. Others rejected it, felt the injustice keenly, fought against it in whatever ways they could. Most probably felt some complicated mix, accepting parts of their role while resenting others. And through it all, they kept doing the work, the official work when it came, and all the unofficial work that filled the rest of their time. They set broken bones and removed dead horses and made salves from questionable ingredients. They maintained their tools and taught their children and tried to save enough money for some security. They were professional outcasts, essential pariahs,
necessary untouchables. They existed in a contradiction that their society created and enforced, and they found ways to survive and sometimes even thrive. The weird jobs, the side hustles, the entrepreneurial spirit required to build life in the margins, all of that shows human adaptability. Give people the smallest opening and they'll make something out of it. Tell them they can only do certain jobs and they'll become experts at those jobs. Exclude them from the normal economy and they'll build their own. Medieval executioners ended up being medical practitioners and sanitation workers and animal handlers and small business owners, because they had to be. The official role didn't pay enough. The stigma blocked normal paths, so they adapted.
And in adapting, they revealed something about the system. The supposedly rigid social hierarchy had gaps. The dishonor that was meant to be absolute was actually negotiable around the edges. The boundaries that were supposed to be clear turned out to be fuzzy. An executioner couldn't be a baker, but he could be a healer, which required just as much skill and served people just as directly. He couldn't join a guild, but he could run a business. He couldn't sit in the good seats at church, but he could pray just as sincerely as anyone else. The system kept trying to make executioners fundamentally other, and the executioners kept demonstrating that they were fundamentally human. Same needs, same capabilities, same capacity for good work and family love and professional pride. It's a tension that ran through the entire existence of this profession, right up until it faded away. Society needed these people, but couldn't admit to needing them. Executioners provided essential services, but had to do it from the margins. Everyone was complicit in a system that everyone kind of knew was wrong, but nobody wanted to change. When you think about it on a quiet night like this, it's kind of overwhelming. All those lives lived in that peculiar space. All those children born into stigma. All those skilled hands doing necessary work while being treated as tainted. All those broken bones set by men who knew anatomy from grim experience. All those dead animals hauled away so the town stayed clean. All those salves prepared, however questionable their ingredients, by people who genuinely wanted to heal. All those families making do with what they had, building parallel lives alongside a society that needed them but rejected them. And then all of it fading away. The whole elaborate system of stigma and survival, until all that's left are scattered records and the occasional family story and the curiosity of people like us, lying in bed hundreds of years later, wondering what it was really like.
To be the executioner's child, knowing your life's path was set before you could walk. To be the executioner's wife, skilled in healing but unable to claim it. To be the executioner himself, competent and professional and completely excluded. The strangeness of it, the waste of it, the human resilience in spite of it, all of it happened, was real, shaped countless lives across centuries, and the vast majority of those lives left almost no trace. We remember the Franz Schmidts who kept detailed diaries, but what about all the executioners who didn't? What about their wives and children? What about the quiet lives lived in stigmatized spaces? They existed. They mattered to themselves and to each other. They got up every morning and did what needed doing, whether that was sharpening a sword, or setting a bone, or hauling a carcass, or just making dinner for their family. And most of the time, most of them weren't executing anyone. They were just living, working, adapting, surviving, being human in circumstances that tried very hard to tell them they were something else.
So that's what medieval executioners did when they weren't executing people. They did everything else they could, carved out what lives they could, persisted through a system designed to marginalize them. It's not a cheerful story, but it is a human one, and maybe that's enough to think about as you drift off tonight. People finding ways forward, even in the narrowest spaces, building something, even with the heaviest stigma, living, even when the world says your life is tainted. Sleep well. The executioners of history did their work, official and otherwise, and then they faded into the past. Their strange, contradictory, surprisingly mundane lives are over now, but they happened, and for a little while tonight, we've remembered them. Not as bogeymen or symbols or historical curiosities, just as people. People with difficult jobs and side hustles and families and all the complicated humanity that entails. That's the story. Thanks for listening. See you next time.